The general election 2014, I hope you sent your ballot in, and if you did, you would have noticed there were some issues on those ballots, 591 and 594. My name is Scott Roberts. I'm the Citizen Action Network Director with the Freedom Foundation, and joining me here in the CUV.com studios is Glenn Morgan, the Ascended High Master of Political Messaging and the utility man from the Freedom Foundation. So Glenn, on the ballot here were a number of ballot issues, statewide initiatives. Two of them were competing gun initiatives. One was 594, universal background checks, and one was 591. An initiative that was put on by the Second Amendment Foundation's political action arm. So it looks like the 594 is passing by an overwhelming majority, and it looks like the 591 is going to be defeated, which really isn't that surprising on either front that it happened.
You know, it's in a way it's not surprising considering how much money, a lot of outsider money, in fact a lot of billionaires threw millions of dollars into the 594 initiative. And you know, both of these deal with gun rights basically, and the Freedom Foundation, we don't focus on gun control issues or Second Amendment issues as much. But we are very much about the Constitution and our freedoms and our rights. And of course, the Second Amendment is a very important part of the federal Constitution, and our gun, the right to self-defense and firearms and all that is a very important part of our state Constitution. In fact, it's actually stronger in our state Constitution. But what's interesting really about these two initiatives, there's more of a story here about strategy and how you can confuse the voters and how bad ideas can sometimes get through the initiative process.
Well, let's talk about 594 just for a second. Because 594 is universal background checks.
That's what it was sold as.
Yeah, it was sold as that. I think it's wildly popular. I think even, you know, law-abiding citizens that own guns and believe that there should be background checks. So it's not like that piece in particular is like a radical idea.
Right.
But even by the accounts of the initiative makers, it was a fairly poorly written initiative because it leaves a lot of gray areas and holes for interpretation, which hopefully the legislature will fix here as we move forward in time.
Yeah, and unfortunately the legislature, or they'll end up being legal battles over it, which is the more waste of energy and time. But yeah, what it looks like, the problem is it was an 18-page initiative. You know, these initiatives, Tim Eyman has lost on this frequently when he's run his initiatives in the state where it's been too complex or too many issues on it. However, if it's not Tim Eyman, it really gets challenged on that at the state level. This initiative was 18 pages of poorly written law. And so the problem is the poorly written law is really what people were concerned about. And it wasn't so much the fact that people, when you go buy a gun, you already have to do a background check. You already have to do a background check at nearly all the gun shows. Those issues were not as much the focus, and that's what it was being sold as. The problem is, as it was written, and as it's probably going to be interpreted by the Department of Licensing, it introduces all of these odd issues where you could be prosecuted if I loaned you a gun at the gun range, where you could have, in order to keep track of everything, you're going to have to come up with a registration list of firearms in the state, which has always been a concern for those who are concerned about the Second Amendment because that's usually the first step in the confiscation process. All of these other issues were brought into just a poorly written law. Now, normally in Washington state, the history of these gun laws is not very positive for those who supported them. I remember in 1997 they tried to push the equivalent of the Brady Bill in Washington state. It failed by 72%. And originally it polled very, very high, just like this current gun initiative did in the beginning. At that time, the gun supporters, the pro-Second Amendment folk, tended to band together. They fought a great campaign. It was a grassroots campaign. Not a lot of money that they spent, but they defeated it overwhelmingly at the polls. In this case, it was very different. What happened is the pro-594, this pro-gun control initiative, they attracted an amazing amount of money, millions and millions of dollars. We'll have to look at the PDC to see what the final count is, but it was one of the most funded initiatives recently, certainly in this cycle. And they did television ads and they did mailers to everybody in the state, and they really made it sound like this is a public safety issue, when in reality most of the sheriffs in the state opposed it. And they opposed it because it takes law-abiding citizens who've committed no crime and it turns them into criminals based on some kind of paperwork issue.
Right. This over-criminalization.
Yeah, which is always a problem. So unfortunately, we're probably looking at future litigation. We're probably looking at other things. However, one of the reasons why I think 1997 didn't repeat itself this year in 2014 was because of the confusion on the ballot caused by 591, which was the other initiative. And the intention of 591, and it was put on by the Second Amendment Foundation. I consider myself friends of the Second Amendment Foundation. I love what they do. I was an intern there, you know, back in the early 90s, so I have a close affinity with this organization. But They put this on with good intentions. They decided to do this about a year ago, and their idea was, we're going to run this initiative because it's going to say that you cannot pass a state law that is more restrictive than federal law. It kind of harmonizes the laws in Washington State. Very simple, one-page initiative, and it was confusing. And it was confusing not to the insiders, not to people who really follow this stuff very closely. It was confusing to the average voter, who all he knows is there's two competing gun control-ish sort of issues. So on the ballot, and it's not clear to the average citizen because they aren't going to take the time to read the 18 pages of the one bill, and they aren't going to necessarily understand what the other bill says. And so frequently, I can't tell you how many times I heard over the last year, what's the difference between these two bills? It was a common question that people would raise out there.
Yeah, I did too, and I know it was a real alarm to me. It was a real red flag that went up when I would hear what I would know is pretty conservative folks coming to me and saying, I'm not sure what the difference is between these two initiatives, and people that are generally plugged in.
Right.
If those kinds of people are confused, the average public is going to be really confused.
Right.
And I think the best thing when you're confused on, especially on 18-page law, right, would just be to vote against it, and rework it. But that's not how people vote, right?
Right.
And I'm not sure it's a great strategy to put competing initiatives on the ballot. I know there's a lot of reasons, and it sounds good in boardrooms and in theory and that kind of thing. But I think it's best to just go head over tackle on a lot of these things. Yep. There's no initiative out there that doesn't start polling well above 70%. They're always wildly popular. So if you're playing defense against an initiative, the idea is to bring it from a wildly high percentage rate that polls and bring it down under 50. And you need to just go and run and add and educate people as to why this would be a bad impact on their lives.
You know, and I think that part of the problem then is that you figure to get Initiative 591, which was the pro-gun sort of initiative, to get that on the ballot, that costs about $1.2 million. Now, if that $1.2 million, and then whatever money was spent to support 591, which is probably another maybe 100,000, I haven't looked at the PDC, but there was some money spent to support it. If you had taken all of that money instead and had a very clear, clean, simple message, keep it simple, about how bad 594 was, if you were a strong Second Amendment supporter, that would have been a very clear message to you. Washington State has a very high rate of gun ownership. It has a very pro-Second Amendment, Democrat or Republican. It tends to have that's one of those issues that tends to poll very well. And it seems to be ingrained into most Washingtonians, the ability to own firearms and to defend themselves. And if you have a very clear message on that, I think that especially in this 2014 cycle, 594 probably would have failed. And you don't have to believe me on that. The guy from Washington Ceasefire said the same thing in the recent debate they had up in Seattle. He said, hey, if the NRA had spent $1 million to oppose this a while ago, it probably would have failed.
Well, 2014 elections brings a test case to Washington. We are now the test case for universal background checks and Bloomberg's ideas. And so we're going to have to see how it unfolds, see how the legislature deals with it and goes for it. There was one other ballot, I think it's worth mentioning, one other issue that was on the ballot, which is the classroom size. At the time that we're recording this, it's too close to call.
Right, Initiative 1351. Yep.
Yeah, 1351. It's too close to call. It's basically a toss-up, and it won't probably be decided for weeks to come. But you can tune in here at thecuv.com, where they'll keep you updated in coverage, or you can go to myfreedomfoundation.com. We'll certainly let you know the outcome of that particular election. I'd like to thank thecuv.com for the use of their studios. It's always a pleasure to come here and use these fine facilities. And thanks to my colleague, Glenn Morgan, the Ascended High Master of Political Messaging, for helping with this roundtable discussion.